All right, guys. So for this lesson, we're going to be talking about abolitionists. Abolitionists are people that would do anything that they could to end slavery. I'm getting you guys back so you can see the boards better. So they're doing anything they can to end slavery. First one we're going to talk about is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland. Now that's important. A lot of these slave people that we're going to learn about, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, are born in Maryland or in northern slave states. Now the reason that that's important, come over here and look at the map. We got Maryland right there. All right, so there's the map. Maryland's right here. All right, so this yellow state, that's Maryland. Washington, D.C. is right here. The thing is, you go right here, this is a free state. All right, so Maryland is really close to free state territory. Shortly after he's born, he is separated from his mother, and he is raised by his grandparents. His father was an unidentified white man. He lived with them till the age of 6, where he is sent somewhere else. The age of 8, he is sent to Baltimore, also in Maryland, and he became a houseboy for a couple named Hugh and Sophia Auld. Sophia, very shortly after he arrived, began teaching him his alphabet. When Hugh found out, that was stopped because that's against the slave codes. Douglass at this point teaches himself to learn how to read. He actually takes his food and trades it with the neighborhood children to teach him how to read and write. And he saves his own money and buys a copy of the book called the Columbian Orator, which was the school book back then. The school book back then taught you English, history, Bible, and all of your school stuff was in that one book. You only had one textbook. At the age of 15, Douglass is sent back to his master's plantation, where he is made a field hand, and where he sees the true horrors that slavery actually had. During this time, he meets a slave breaker named Edward Covey. The two actually end up in a fight, a fist fight, where it ends in a draw. And surprisingly, he is not executed for fighting a white man. But Douglass does learn that white people aren't any better than he is. No son of a man. At the age of 18, he plans an escape but calls it off. And then he is sent back to the Auld family, where he does escape at the age of 20 by impersonating a sailor. He moves to Massachusetts, where he meets his wife, Anna Murray, begins a family, and then he moves to Washington, D.C., which is honestly really risky since he is an escaped slave, and Washington, D.C. is right next to Maryland. So if he had been caught, penalties could have been really, really severe. He becomes an abolitionist, but he's not just against slavery, he's also a champion for women's rights as well. Douglass first publishes an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star, and he attends a women's rights conference called the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. He would later become an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, a U.S. Marshal, and foreign minister to the Republic of Haiti. After the 13th Amendment was passed, this is something you guys need to understand, it is not the Emancipation Proclamation that ends slavery. It is the 13th Amendment. After it is passed, Douglass worked for a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison calls for the end of the anti-slavery society and the newspaper called The Liberator, because he says the goal of emancipation is accomplished. Emancipation is going to be one of your vocabulary words. We'll just go ahead and hit it right now. Emancipation means to free someone from bondage. All right, to free someone from bondage. Doesn't have to be slavery, it could be prison as well. Kids, when they want to get free from their parents, can actually sue for their emancipation. Usually it's like a 17-year-old, 16-year-old, because their parents aren't treating them right. They can actually sue for emancipation. But Douglass responded, slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Second vocabulary word is ballot. You'll get all your vocabulary words in the last lesson, the one before, and this one. Ballot is the piece of paper that a person uses to vote on. So it's what you actually vote on. Today we have electronic ballots. Douglas continued in the fight to gain blacks the right to vote until he dies. He says that was what will bring true equality. Douglas's first wife, Anna, died in 1882. 2 years later, he marries a white woman who is 20 years younger than him. Really controversial back then. In fact, in most states, it was illegal. Her name was Helen Pitts. Now, just so you guys know, yes, she is 20 years younger than him. But in 1884, Frederick Douglass was born in 1818. So that's going to put him in his 60s. So she's in her 40s. All right, so it's not like he's really old and she's really young. They're both kind of up there. Frederick Douglass dies February 20th, 1895 of a massive heart attack. Next person is William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison began his career. He's a white guy now. All right, so we've had a escaped slave. Now we've got a white guy. He began his career as a printer's apprentice. He was the editor of a newspaper called the Newbury Herald, and he was later the National Philanthropist. Philanthropist is your third vocabulary word for this lesson. Philanthropist is somebody that donates large amounts of money to causes, to charities, like Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, people like that have tons of money and they just donate the money. In 1828, Garrison became involved with Benjamin Lundy, who was a Quaker. Now, if you guys remember, Quakers believed everybody was equal. And he becomes a co-editor for their newspaper. Originally, Garrison was a member of the American Colonization Society, which believed that the way to fight against slavery was to send all black people back to Africa, even though a lot of black people were not from Africa to begin with. Garrison was what was called a gradualist. He did not believe slavery should be ended immediately, but he does believe slavery is wrong and it should be phased out. His views change after he wrote an article, though. When he wrote this article, he was sued for libel and imprisoned for it because he criticized a slave trading merchant. After his release from prison, Garrison believed that slavery needed to have an immediate end. Because of his new beliefs, Garrison and Lundy split ways, and Garrison forms a newspaper called The Liberator. This is the one that Frederick Douglass will work on for a little bit. The Liberator not only targeted those who owned slaves, but also people who did not speak out against slavery, even if they thought it was wrong. In the first issue of The Liberator, Garrison makes this statement: "I do not wish to think, speak, or write with moderation." Meaning, I'm not going to hold back. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. So he is very passionate about his beliefs here. Garrison was extremely unpopular in the South, even to the point where they had a $5,000 bounty for his arrest and conviction. And he was unpopular in the North, too, because of his attacks on things like the church that didn't speak out against slavery. Even some abolitionists were against Garrison because they believed his attacks were so harsh that it would turn people against their cause. Garrison was seen as a radical. He forms the Anti-Slavery Society, which had membership and leadership from a number of women, and he turns on his former friend, Frederick Douglass, after the 13th Amendment was passed. Garrison starts promoting the idea of women's suffrage. Suffrage, vocab word here. Suffrage is the right to vote. It does not mean to go through pain. In fact, the word suffer doesn't mean pain either. It just means to go through something. Suffrage is the right to vote, though. He is a pacifist. He's against violence. And he is for the temperance movement. Temper does not mean anger. Temper means to control. When you lose your temper, you've lost your control. The temperance movement was the movement to control the drinking of alcohol. In 1854, at an anti-slavery rally, Garrison burned a copy of the United States Constitution. And although he is a pacifist, he supported the actions of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, which we'll learn about in the next lesson. John Brown, very violent guy. His nickname was God's Angel of Death. Garrison is also in favor of secession, but not of the South leaving. He's in favor of the North leaving, the slave-holding South. Once the Civil War began, Garrison abandons his views on pacifism. He supports the war, but he is critical of Lincoln's goal, because Lincoln had one goal in the Civil War: to bring the country back together, not to end slavery. In 1865, after the 13th Amendment, like I said, he ends the Liberator, continues his life fighting for the other causes he believed in. Next woman is Isabella Baumfree. She escaped slavery in 1826 with her infant daughter. The next year, the state of New York emancipated all slaves. Now, we've already gone over this. Emancipated means to free from bondage. This emancipation placed Isabella in the middle of a court battle, because Isabella, when she ran away in 1826 with her infant daughter, did not take all of her kids. She left a son behind, and her son was sold to a slaveholder in Alabama after the emancipation. That was illegal. Isabella wins the lawsuit. Her son is returned. Isabella converts to Christianity and moves to New York City and becomes part of a Methodist perfectionist commune. It's a cult ran by a guy named Matthias. The commune falls apart when Matthias was charged with sexual allegations of raping young women and murder. And the cult falls apart after that. Isabella herself was accused of poisoning people in the paper, which she sues them for libel and wins. So she's won 2 court cases now. 1843, Isabella takes the name of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner means traveler. So her name's literally the Traveling Truth. She believed that she was supposed to be an evangelist and spread the word of God. In 1840, she becomes a spokesperson for the women's suffrage movement. And in the 1840s, she is women's suffrage in the 50s, abolitionist in the 40s. Her most famous speech was, "Ain't I a Woman?" In this, this is the speech right here. So it's in your notes for the lesson. If you read it, it is kind of interesting. She starts off basically saying that women should be educated, and then she attacks men. Basically saying that women had a role in the birth of Jesus. You had God, the Holy Spirit, and Mary, a woman, but men had no part in it. So she's saying men think they're all high and mighty, but they didn't even have any part in the birth of Jesus, so they need to shut up. That's basically her speech summarized. Truth met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is a famous author we're going to talk about in a minute. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the introduction to Sojourner Truth's autobiography because Sojourner Truth could not read or write. Truth then moves to Battle Creek, Michigan, joins other communes, eventually becoming a Millerite, part of a group which would later become the Seventh-day Adventists. During the Civil War, she raises food and supplies for the North and meets with Abraham Lincoln in 1864. While at the White House, she tries to end the discrimination of streetcars based on race, which is weird because she also fights to get a state just for black people in the West. So she doesn't want discrimination, but yet she wants segregation. She wants a state just for black people in the West. Truth focuses the rest of her life on gaining rights for black people, on women's suffrage, and temperance. You're going to find this is a common string of thought that people that fought for abolition also wanted women's rights and temperance. They wanted to control alcohol. Truth remains active until her grandson died. At that point, she returned to Battle Creek, Michigan, where she died in a sanatorium. A sanatorium was a hospital that treated people that had terminal diseases like tuberculosis and cancer. So if you go to a sanatorium, chances are you're never leaving. She dies there. She gets infected sores on her legs. She actually, that's a common thing that happened, bed sores. Harriet Beecher Stowe, we talked about her a minute ago. She is the author that wrote Sojourner Truth's autobiography introduction. Sojourner Truth, she wrote that story, but she's more famous for another one. Harriet Beecher Stowe was one of 9 children born to a minister named Lyman Beecher. Harriet's mother died when she was 5. Her brothers became ministers, and she married a minister, so her whole life is involved in the church. Her life directed her views on abolition. By being so involved with the church, she disagreed with slavery, and by losing her mother at a young age, she felt like she could kind of relate to children who were slaves that lost their mothers at young ages because they were sold off. While growing up, she was an excellent student and a great writer. And as an adult, she put these passions for writing aside until her sister-in-law convinced her to write a book trying to help the abolitionist movement. That book that she wrote was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and which at that point in time outsold any book in history with the exception of the Bible. The book tells a story of 2 slaves, one that escapes to freedom in Canada and another one named Uncle Tom, who was sold many times, going into many different types of families, all of them good, until he ends up with his last master, who orders him to beat another slave. When Tom refuses, the punishment for him is he actually gets beaten to death. But because of the emotional connection that people have made to Tom when they read the book, it makes them angry. And Tom's not a real person, but they are angry now at the South for Tom's death. Many Southerners spoke out against this book, saying it's an exaggeration that slave owners really didn't treat their slaves like this, but they didn't really care. After the Civil War, Harriet and her husband helped open a school for newly freed slaves to gain an education, and she speaks out for black rights and women's rights. Next woman. Her original name was Araminta, but she's more commonly known as Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland as a slave. Harriet Tubman's family was destroyed when her master illegally sold many of her family out of the state. In Maryland, it was illegal because that could cause slaves to have a reason to rebel. While growing up, Tubman had a number of horrible incidents, from being hired out temporarily to cruel masters to a time an angry overseer, remember overseers were white, the overseer threw an iron weight at another slave, missed, and hit Harriet Tubman in the head, which caused her to have migraines and seizures the rest of her life. 1844, Harriet Tubman married a free black man named John Tubman. They had children. And then in March of 1849, Tubman's master died, which puts her family in danger because children, what they are, whether they're free or slave, is determined by their mother. So all of her children are slaves. And even though it was illegal to be sold off, since her master's dead, inheritance could be passed to other states where her children could be sold. Tubman used the Underground Railroad, which is not underground, it's not a railroad, all right? It's just a secret path, to find her way to Philadelphia by following the North Star. Between 1850 and 1860, she led around 12 escape trips, helping her family and friends escape slavery. So she's not helping everybody, just her family and friends. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, caused Tubman to lead many of them to St. Catharines, Ontario, because the Fugitive Slave Act actually said if you were caught by a slave catcher, even if you're in a free state, you could be returned. And in fact, you'd be given a reward. If I was a slave catcher and I caught you, I would be given a reward for catching you. So there were people looking around for escaped slaves. In 1858, Tubman met John Brown, that God's special angel of death guy, who was actually recruiting her to join the raid on Harper's Ferry, but Tubman got sick and couldn't go. In 1862, she joins the Union military as a nurse and eventually becomes a spy for the North. And in 1863, she becomes the first woman to command an armed military raid. She led the 2nd Carolina Black Regiment and saved over 700 slaves that day. More slaves than she did the entire time on the Underground Railroad. Tubman continues to fight for equality until the end of her life, becoming involved in the women's suffrage movement once again. She makes humanitarian efforts to help create a home for the aged, basically an old folks' home. And after the Civil War, she suffers through financial difficulties and dies at the age of 91 in 1913. The Grimke sisters. They are from South Carolina. They grew up in a slave-holding family. They grew up wealthy. The sisters developed an anti-slavery sentiment after seeing how their father treated their slaves. Their father also prevented them from gaining an education because they were women. However, they taught themselves how to read and write by sneaking into their brothers' rooms at night and stealing their textbooks. Because of their beliefs on slavery, they moved away from the South but continued their efforts to end slavery. All right, your essential question for this lesson. Pretty simple. How did the abolitionist movement help lead towards a civil war? So all these people today, we had white women, white men, black women, black men. All of them are fighting to end slavery. Some of them are from the South. Some of them are from the North. How could this help cause a civil war? All right, that's what you need to put in your answer. Think of examples. Think of things that they did that caused fighting. All right, you got one lesson left that I will get up soon. I'll talk to you guys later.